Good morning. Welcome to yet another edition of our Bgcse history sessions. In our installment today, our focus is on the British administrative reforms. That is the changes which were introduced by the British at the Cape after 1806. Now, our discussions of these administrative reforms shall depend predominantly on two policies which were introduced by the British at the Cape from as early as 1813. Now, these policies were, or changes if you wish, were anchored on two policies: the British land policy as well as the broad Anglicization policy. Now, the Anglicization policy, I said, was broad because of the many tentacles, the many facets it had. And the examples that I'm going to cite will certainly go along in, in ensuring or showing rather that indeed the policy of Anglicization was broad. Once again, welcome to this live feed. Now, if you recall very well, we indicated sometimes in the past that the British wanted to turn the Cape into a self-supporting, colony, a colony which was self-sufficient, a colony which had the ability to pay for itself. Now, for that to be achieved, they had to introduce a system which was efficient, an administrative system, an administrative machinery which was efficient. Let's take our first example, the land policy or the land reform, which was introduced in 1813. Now, the policy was introduced in 1813 at a time when Lieutenant Cradock was the governor at the Cape. We must understand that the land policy was actually intended to do away with the inefficient land policy, which was in use at the Cape when the Cape was still under the control of the Dutch East India Company, virtually under the Dutch. So basically, the policy was meant to repeal or to replace the old loan farm system, which used to be in operation when the Dutch were in charge. So it basically abolished it. So if you abolish the loan farm system, in essence, you are limiting the freedoms that Boers used to enjoy hitherto the introduction of the new land policy. Now, if you recall very well, under the loan farm system, Boers only had to make an application to the authorities of the Dutch East India Company at the Cape that they needed to be given a new piece of land. And there were no restrictions in terms of how large that piece of land could be. So what we see with the new policy that was introduced by the British in 1813 is that the freedoms that the Boers used to enjoy uh, were brought under check. There were restrictions, in other words, in terms of what they could do with the land that they were given. There were restrictions, to be more precise, on the size of land that they could be granted or they could be given. At this juncture, I think it is fitting that perhaps we uh, briefly look into the aspects of the British land policy of 1913, which was introduced by Governor Cradock, like I indicated a while ago. Perhaps at the center of this reform was the stipulation that land would now become a saleable commodity. That is to say, before you could gain ownership of land, you had to buy it. And the buyer, by the look of things, would be somebody who had the deepest pockets, who had the most money, because land would be auctioned off. And in an auction sale, it is usually those who have more money than the other who gets to benefit. And in this particular instance, if land was auctioned, those with more money would stand a better chance of gaining ownership of such land. Now, remember we said the system of land ownership, which was anchored upon loans being given out to prospective landowners, came to an end. So instead of you being loaned out, land parcels, you had now to have a title deed, which was virtually a certificate of ownership. So the requirement, in other words, was that because now land is a saleable property, you also had to have a certificate of ownership to the land that was given to you, to the land that you would have acquired. So land also became a permanent, property. So once you are given it, it forever remained your personal, property. So land under the new British land policy became a permanent holding, which means a permanent, property. And that is why you had to have a title deed. Now, over and above that, landowners were required as a matter of law to pay an annual rent for all land holdings that they had under their names. So this annual rent was known as quit rent, QUITRENT, quit rent, which basically is an annual amount of money that you had to pay for the land holding that you had. So, in short, those were the stipulations of the new land policy. It is a policy which was very different in all respects to the land policy which was in operation when the Cape was under the control of the Dutch East India Company. Now, as we move forward, we also need to interrogate the reactions of the Boers, the Dutch settlers. Were they amenable to the policy? Were they amenable to the stipulations of the new land policy? Now, let's understand the context within which the Boers actually, reacted to this particular land reform. To them, as God's chosen people, they had this inalienable right, a right that you could not take away from them, that is, to not only have or to decide where they settled, but also they had the freedom, the God given privilege or right to settle on land whose dimensions were not restricted. In other words, no one was to determine the size of land a typical Dutch person could settle on. So the new policy placed restrictions in terms of the size of land a particular person could settle on. Now, if in the eyes of the Boers, the policy promoted that which was against their religious beliefs, then it is a policy that had to be rejected. So the Boers, in other words, did not accept the British land policy because it placed restrictions in terms of the size of land that they could own. It denied them the freedom to settle wherever they pleased, as I indicated just a short while ago. So it robbed them of the freedom to settle wherever they wanted. The other important thing to note in relation to this particular policy is that if you are a Boer person and you are told that you can only settle on a piece of land this size, that was also a denial of your birthright, a right that was conferred on you by your God as a superior person. So the British come in and they placed restrictions, limitations in terms of you know um, the size of the land that you could have access to. So to them, this was tantamount, if not clearly, an attempt by the British to deny you the right to enjoy that freedom, the God-given, freedom. So it is quite understandable, therefore, that if you are a Dutch person, the only option that was available to you was to elect with your feet to move out of the Cape, far away from the British, perhaps into the interior, where once you are free of British control, you'd get back to enjoying your good God-given freedoms and or privileges. So in essence, we are saying when some of the Boers left the Cape in the 1830s, they left on account of them not being happy with the British land policy. So it was a way of them showing their disgust, their hatred towards the British land policy. So they are hoping that once they have ridden themselves of British control, they'll get back to enjoy their God-given freedom. So there, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, you have your first administrative reform that was introduced at the Cape by the British. And remember, there is a change. It's a law which was introduced in 1813. Quickly, let's look at another example. Now, I earlier said the British Anglicization policy of the 1820s was very broad. It was very broad in terms of what it is that the policy sought to achieve. Now, in general terms, Anglicization as a policy was concerned with turning the Cape settlement into an English colony. And there were several ways through which such could be achieved. For example, you could increase the population of English speakers at the Cape, a physical increase in terms of their numbers. Say, for example, by encouraging immigration to the Cape of English speakers. You could also achieve Anglicization by introducing pieces of law, rules and regulations, or administrative instruments, which were a mirror image of that which the British had back in England. So let's jump straight into the examples. Let's start with this one. Let's set the tone with the example of the 1820 settlers, who we must add were 5,000 in number. So in 1820, we see the arrival of 5,000 Englishmen at the Cape, who were to turn the Cape into their permanent home. In others, the intention was not to return these folks back to England after some time. The Cape was to become their new home. So this happened in 1820. Now, as you should be aware, Britain, like some of the major industrial powers, were grappling with socioeconomic problems during the 19th century. However, in the case of Britain, the severity of the socioeconomic problems was more intense on account of the British having been the first nation to industrialize. So the Industrial Revolution had led to a situation where, machines replaced people on the factory floor. So people lost their jobs to machines. Jobs which were performed by human beings were now performed more efficiently by machines. So those whose jobs were taken by machines had to suffer the ignominy of unemployment. And this, in many ways, in many respects, was a powder keg, in the sense that it put the government under pressure to say, address our plight, failing which we vote you out of office. So respective British governments, in other words, were under immense pressure to address this crisis of unemployment. So one sure way of addressing this particular problem was to encourage immigration. Before the 1820 settlers arrived at the Cape, Australia, Canada, and North America, the USA in particular, were conduits. They were the available options in terms of them being used as alternative places of or areas of settlement for the excess population, which, like I said earlier, were grappling with unemployment. They were part of the unemployment statistics. So the Cape became an option because it was a British colony. So the Cape became the new promised land, if you wish. So upon arrival, each one of the settlers was given 40 hectares of land on which they could settle. and at the same time, farm, venture into agriculture. Now, the settlers, once they were at the Cape, obviously increased. They boosted the number of English speakers within the borders of the Cape Colony. So there you are. Your policy of Anglicization is bearing fruit almost immediately. Now let's think in terms of the reactions of the Boers. For obvious reasons, they were not happy. It is a policy that they were against, because in their views, the settlers were impure people whose very presence at the Cape, or his mere presence at the Cape, would surely contaminate the purity of the Dutch, folks. So there is your reason as to why the Dutch would be against um, the arrival of the 1820 settlers. Over and above that, if you look at the area where these settlers were to be settled, it was in the Saarveld, on the eastern frontier of the Cape Colony. Now, this is a part of the Cape Colony which was eyed by Boers. In other words, in the foreseeable future, Boer settlement, or settlements rather, would expand in that direction. So when the settlers were settled in that territory, the immediate interpretation of the Boers was that this was an attempt by the British to stop Boer expansion in that direction. But on the other hand, the British were saying, we want to secure the eastern frontier by settling these 5,000 English speakers in this territory. Unfortunately, to the Dutch farmer, this was not the case. It was a mere attempt by the British to stifle Boer expansion towards the east. Let's take another example in terms of the specific features of the Anglicization policy. Now, our example here would be the introduction of a new currency in the place of the Dutch Rix dollar, which was the currency that was in use, that was in circulation when the Dutch settlement was under the Dutch. So this new currency was actually introduced in 1825 to take the place of the Dutch Rix dollar. Now, there were justifications on the part of the British as to why a new currency had to be introduced. To them, the surest way of addressing the Cape's dire financial and economic situation was introducing a new currency, which was valuable, which had more value as compared to the Dutch Rix dollar. And around that period, the Dutch Rix dollar had actually lost value. It is a currency that was not worth the paper on which it was printed. It had no value, in other words. So a new valuable currency in the eyes of the British was the panacea, was the solution to addressing the Cape's dire, financial and economic situation. So this was called the English pound. As it has been the norm, our approach has always been that once we have described an intervention, a reform that was introduced by the British, we also would make an attempt to try to gauge the reaction of the Boers towards that particular reform. And instinctively, I would want to believe you have drawn the conclusion that this was yet another reform that was not readily accepted by the Boers. And I suppose you have come to realize that if you are a Boer person, you would always justify your opposition of these reforms by always indicating that this is an attempt by the British to stop you from practicing your culture, or an attempt by them to stop you from enjoying certain privileges which were conferred upon you by your maker on account of you being a superior people. And if that is your line of thinking, you are not too far away from the truth. The gospel truth in this particular case was that the Riksdollar, the Dutch Riksdollar, had immense, significant cultural importance to the Dutch. So their currency was a symbol of their being as a people. It was an important part of their culture. So if you replace their currency, you are basically denying them or even removing an important symbol of their culture. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is your justification, if you are a Dutch person, for standing up in arms against the introduction of a new currency. Quickly, let's talk about the introduction of English as the official language of the Cape. This is a development which came into being in 1828, that English was declared the official language of the Cape Colony. And for obvious reasons, it was replacing the Dutch language. So by virtue of it being the official language of the Cape, the English language had to be used in schools, in courts, and in government offices. So this is what was done in 1828. Now, the Boers, it's a constant theme, it's a common theme that we need to interrogate. We're once again against the use of English, or the English language as the official language of the Cape. And we must appreciate that a sizable number of Dutch settlers were not fluent in the English language. Some could not speak it, let alone understand it. So if all of a sudden the expectations are that you must communicate effectively in the English language for you to be able to get assistance from a government office, that really would place restrictions in terms of how far you could go to get such kind of assistance. Perhaps this was ironic that, The Dutch consider themselves to be a superior race. But despite their superiority, they did not understand the English language. Instead, some Kwekwe, who were their former servants, understood and spoke better English compared to their former Boer masters. It was quite embarrassing, isn't it? It's quite an embarrassing situation to find yourself in as a superior person who now, is coerced to rely on the services of a person that you consider to be inferior to you. So some of them had to rely on the Kwekwe. The Kwekwe were their interpreters. So what do you do as a Dutch person who finds themselves in that situation? Perhaps you need to venture into the interior, far away from the British, to save yourself this embarrassment. It is also important to note that, as like it is the case with many people, language is a form of our cultural heritage. So if you are no longer allowed to use your mother tongue, if your mother tongue is no longer the official language in a country of your birth, your country of residence, clearly you would argue that you are being denied the right to practice your culture. Your cultural heritage is being stolen from you. That was the sentiment that was expressed and even shared by a sizable majority of especially frontier Boers or Dutch settlers. A little interesting piece of information is that if you take the example of the British language policy, the introduction of the English language as the official language of the Cape, it is the Kwekwe who were literate who got to benefit from the introduction of this policy. Because like I said earlier, some of them became court clerks, they became interpreters, and they earned wages for the services they rendered to the courts. So if you earn a wage, most definitely you'd use it how meager it is to make ends meet. So that, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, shall suffice in terms of shedding light on the British administrative reforms which were introduced at the Cape from 1813 all the way into the 1820s. And what we have shown here is that these reforms were not favored by the Boers. There was a strong opposition towards them, and different explanations were thrown around to try to explain why, the reforms had to be rejected. But if you are the British, at the very pith of your justification, your reasons for introducing these particular reforms is the argument that you wanted to turn the Cape colony into an efficient colony capable of paying for its administration. A quick comment on examinations, examine questions to be more precise. You should be able to describe these reforms. You should be able to categorize them into the two broad categories. That is the legal changes or reforms, and on the other hand, the administrative reforms. Because they might ask you to describe British reforms, which were introduced in the 1800s, which were administrative in nature, or those which were legal in nature. So you must be able to say, these are examples of reforms which were administrative, and these are examples of reforms which were legal in terms of their nature. And as you interact, as you intercourse with these changes, you must also be in a position to give an account on the impact of these reforms on the indigenous, not the indigenous, I beg your pardon, on the inhabitants of the Cape. And here you are saying, how did the reforms affect the Kwekwe? How did the reforms impact on the lives of the Dutch settlers? So it is important that you are able to give an account on those. Because clearly, the different constituents of the Cape Colony were affected in different ways by the introduction of these reforms by the British. And finally, you must also be in a position to say which of the reforms benefited the non-whites and which did not. Which of the reforms benefited the whites and which did not. Now, if you look at the earlier reforms, especially the legal changes which were introduced before the 1820s, they tended to benefit the Dutch and not the Kwekwe and other non-white, people resident within the borders of the Cape Colony. But if you fast forward to the 1820s, there's a paradigm shift. There's a big shift because the legal changes in the majority of instances, if not all instances, tended to benefit the non-whites, the Kwekwe, and other free, non-white people resident at the Cape Colony at the time. So that brings us to the end of our exposition, our journey into the British changes at the Cape. In case there are any questions, feel free to field those questions by way of commenting below. And remember to like, to share, and follow the page. That, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our discussions. And remember, there are no alternative facts. Good morning.